If you have your Bibles, would you please take and turn to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, we're continuing our series on the Sermon on the Mount. We look at verses 27 through 32. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. All right, I'm going to tell you up front that this topic we are looking at today is outside my comfort zone. So if I start to blush, or if I use words that replace other words, like I use biblical euphemisms like "he knew her" or physical intimacy, it's not because I'm embarrassed by what the text itself says. It's just my own comfort level of dealing with things. One time I was leading a Bible study at a church, and I was talking about the Corinthian church, and I had to explain a situation in the church. And I had to say it was a bunch of bad people doing things that were supposed to be reserved for a husband and a wife, and they were doing bad things and bad people together doing it one time. And I was just working all the way around trying to say something without saying it. And we had an old lady in the church, and she was a retired school teacher, grumpy as can be. And she was sitting there, and then she finally said, "For goodness sake, Pastor, just say it. It's in blank." And I was like, you can't say that. And I blushed. I turned 3 shades of red. So when I say things, it's just my own comfort level. Because the Bible actually, when it talks about marriage and when it talks about physical intimacy within marriage, it has a high standard of what it says. But it's also very honest about how damaging and how sorrowful and how painful when we don't keep it within the boundaries that God had intended. If I were to use one word to describe how our world views this topic, it would be broken. We live in a broken world. We are broken people, and every aspect of our life is impacted by that brokenness, even this area. And in fact, I would add especially this area. So much so that we see it all around us, and we have just come to accept this as the norm, and we're no longer bothered by it. I was reading this past week a statistic that said that 90% of all physical intimacy on television takes place between unmarried couples. 90%. We're no longer shocked by that. In fact, we're no longer shocked when we hear the news that a politician or another pastor had been guilty of sexual immorality. We're just like, oh yeah, that's what happens. Or when we hear the words of a song that debases women and says awful things. One time at church I served, I was dealing with this issue, and I did something I would never do again, so don't worry, I'm not going to do it ever again. But Ravi Zacharias had once said a quote that said, "If you want to know where culture is at, read its poets." And so I thought, well, today's poets are the song leaders, are the songwriters. And so I took the number one song in America, and it was "Blurred Lines" by Robin Thicke. Y'all don't know that. It's a horrible, horrible things in the song. And I read it word for word. And people were like, oh. And I said, that's what we're listening to. Now, don't worry, I'm not a prude saying you can't listen to that music. I know if you go back to the 60s, 70s, Some of it just as bad. But it's just the norm, we say. But as a church, the church is never supposed to be the norm. The church is never supposed to be like the world. The church is part of a new kingdom, a place where healing, a place where we restore God's original intention and idea and beauty and design in all areas of life, but especially this one. And so the church, in some ways, whenever we deal with this issue, in some ways, we have been guilty of either compromising and lowering our standards to fit the world's standards, to where we just say, this is how things are and this is how we deal with things. Or we go to the opposite extreme to where we deem that this topic is evil and wicked and nasty. I was reading an article by Michelle Whitty, and she said as a kid, she had to go to a class taught by the pastor on this topic. And the way they said it was that sex was bad, sex was dirty, sex was ugly, and you got to save it for the one and when you get married. And she said she was confused by that. Like, wait a minute. And then at the age of 17, she said that she was raped. And she said that validated everything they had said about this issue. And she said from that point on, she said, all men are evil, all men are dirty, everything about this is dirty. And then when it came time when she fell in love and got married, she said she didn't know what to do. Because the one thing that she's supposed to do in a marriage is the one thing she said that made her feel dirty, dispensable, and used. And so she had a hard time getting past that, and it hurt her marriage. So how do we view marriage and intimacy within marriage? Like I said, today we see it as broken, but I want us to see marriage and intimacy within marriage as that beautiful gift that God has given to us. The importance of keeping it within the boundaries, but also going deeper and seeing the inherent worth in every individual, every person. Now, I'll be honest, I wish we could just skip this, move on to next week, sing a few songs, go home. But if Jesus thought to include this in the Sermon on the Mount, it means it's important. And if it's important to Jesus, it's important to us. And I dare say it's probably one of the most important things because it's something that we all deal with and we all have had encounters with. Now, as we go through this, important to remember that in these 6 antitheses that Jesus is saying, he is either correcting or clarifying something, the way the culture has been interpreting a law, or he's trying to get us to go deeper into looking beyond just mere outward obedience to getting to your heart to where you come from a place of love for God and love for others. So he's wanting you to go deeper. And this is where we're going to start with this issue of adultery and lust. Look at verse 27. He says, you have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, some of you read that, you say, okay, do not commit adultery. That first part, you're like, nailed it. I haven't done that. You feel good about it. But then you get to that next part. But anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in their heart. Then you hear that, you're like, man, that's impossible. There is temptation everywhere you look. You can't turn your head when you walk out this door without some kind of advertisement or something right there in your face tempting you. And then it just sounds so ominous. And you're like, how in the world is this possible? And so this is where the world would look at the church and say, see, you Christians, you're so unrealistic with expectations. And you're just a bunch of prudes, you know? You're so anti-fun and all this. But remember, God is a God of love. And whenever God gives a law, it's not just there for the sake of the law. It is there for our benefit. Because God does not want us to miss on the great things he has planned for us. So like when God says, do not steal, It's not simply that stealing is wrong, but he knows in a community, if there is no trust, that community cannot flourish. He says, have no other gods before me, because he knows that we were designed to be his and to have that relationship. And if anything else takes a place at the throne of our heart, our lives crumble. And he doesn't want that for us. And so he says, do not commit adultery. It's not that he's being a killjoy. It's just that he knows the beautiful gift that marriage is, and the pain and sorrow and suffering that comes when that covenant is broken. So let's look, what is the biblical ethic for marriage and for intimacy within marriage? Let me clarify something. There's the biblical standard, and there's what people in the Bible did. Okay? The Bible is filled with people who did bad things. So you can't say that every marriage in the Bible is standard. That's falls short, because there's a lot of bad things that happen in the Bible. But when you look at how God designed marriage, it was a beautiful covenantal relationship. And it was a covenantal relationship. It was more than just a legal agreement. It was more than you just going to a courthouse and saying, okay, I promise, yes, I'll do that. It was more than that. It was more than just an emotional attachment. It was where you are giving yourself, your whole being, your whole person, emotionally, spiritually, physically, everything to a person in a way where you are saying, this relationship is now what defines me. This relationship is me. And I promise that I will be faithful to you. I will uphold this covenant with you. Tim Keller wrote a book on marriage, and he described the difference between what a covenantal relationship and a consumer relationship. And a lot of us treat marriage more like a consumer relationship, like our spouse is a vendor. We go into it saying, okay, if you do this and do that, I will stay with you. But the second I don't think my needs are being met by you, I'm leaving, because you're no longer serving my purpose. Or we may say, I think I found an upgrade. I think I found a better deal, and so I'm going to go with this. So everything is focused on your needs. It's all about you. But a covenantal relationship is the exact opposite. It's where you adjust yourself to the promise of the relationship. Where instead of taking, you are giving of yourself. That's why we say, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, not just good, but bad. I am here with you, and I'm for you. Now, if both parties enter to a marriage seen as a consumer, it's not going to work. It's going to fall apart. If one party enters into a marriage seen as a covenantal relationship and the other person as a consumer, there's going to be exploitation. That person's going to get used. But y'all, I will tell you, there's nothing more beautiful to when both people enter this relationship as a covenantal relationship. I have got to see that. Man, do y'all realize how blessed we are in this church when we look up that screen and it says someone's been married for 60 years, 50 years? I have watched a person sit by their loved one where their mind is gone, but yet they are there by their side every day, loving them, caring for them, taking care of it, and just being a part of their life. Why? Because of the covenant they made with that person till death do we part. And that is such a beautiful, beautiful thing. So in a covenant marriage, you give yourself wholly to your spouse. Genesis 2:24 says the two become one flesh. The two. That's why in marriage, when you get married, you normally take on the name of the person because it's no longer you, it's together. You're one person, and you cleave together. You are one. And this embodiment, this act of physical intimacy within the marriage is supposed to be an act that symbolizes that oneness. It's supposed to be a place where you are so vulnerable, where you don't hide anything and you just come before the person and you give everything of yourself to that person. It's kind of like the glue that cements this thing together. That's why, historically, you would have your wedding, and then on the wedding night, you would seal the wedding with physical intimacy. Because it was a way that you brought your two lives together, and you'd be so close and so intimate. Again, I want to quote Tim Keller. He said, sex was not a way of self-satisfaction. It was not designed to be self-expression, but one of self-donation. It was a way of giving yourself so deeply to another person that the result is oneness, and you give yourself completely to a person. And then he adds, if you are not ready to be that vulnerable in every area of your life with that person, then you are not ready for this act. In other words, if you are not ready to enter that covenantal relationship, then you cannot enter into this simply physical one. And that's why when you view marriage as a covenant, that physical intimacy almost becomes like, it isn't, but it's like a sacrament. The sacrament is an outward expression of inward reality, meaning that this is that beautiful gift of where you come together, symbolizing your relationship, the oneness that is there. But here's the problem. In our society, we have turned this physical intimacy from a covenantal gift to a consumer good. We have taken away everything that was about it for the other person, and we have made it to what can I get from it? How do I feel with it? How can you please me? And then we separate the physical from the emotional and the spiritual oneness. And we wonder why it's such a mess. And what ends up happening is that the other person is seen as an object simply that exists for my gratification, someone to be used. That's not how God designed it. We miss the beauty of the gift, and we devalue the person's inherent worth, and it hurts. Now, that's the standard. But Jesus takes it farther. He adds, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in her heart. Now notice, he doesn't say, all you married men, if you look at another woman. No, he says anyone. This means all of us, if you look at a person with lust. Now, at first glance, when I read that, I immediately feel guilty, because if you ever feel attracted to a person who is beautiful, you see, like, am I sinning? What's going on? Am I guilty of adultery? But that's not what it says here, okay? The word that is used there for lust is the word epithemia, and is used 62 times in the New Testament. Now get this. This was shocking to me. The word is used 62 times. It's only used 2 times in connection with sex. This word that is translated lust. It means a desire to have, a desire to control. The best way to understand it is comparable to greed. Is where you want, and you can't stop thinking about it, and it's there simply for your selfish desire, and you will do whatever it takes to have it, and you don't care who you hurt, who you trample on, or how much you devalue that person. As long as you get what you want, you have it. And that's what that word means. And when you look at a person in that way, you're guilty of committing adultery with them. And I say that because oftentimes we feel guilty for noticing beauty and being attracted to people. And I'll tell you, we're wired for that. We are made for that, to recognize beauty. And if you say you don't, you're lying. Okay? In fact, I want to do a test with you. And I don't want y'all to try to act pretty, and I know that your spouses are right next to you, but I want you to tell me, I'm going to show you 3 images. Tell me who is the prettiest, okay? Vision 1, Reba McEntire. Y'all, I had the biggest crush on Reba when I was a kid. Her picture all over my walls. Look at that red hair. Oh my goodness. Okay. So well, one day I'll tell you about the time I got to go backstage and meet Reba McEntire. Didn't end up the way I wanted, but okay. Second image. Do you recognize this lady? Probably not. I just simply Googled average-looking woman, and she came up. So this is the most average-looking woman according to Google. Okay. Okay. So pretty, but not Reba pretty, right? Okay. C. Y'all remember Mrs. Nagger from Hee Haw? Yeah? Hey, she can play the banjo. Don't ever doubt a woman who plays the banjo. Okay, but let me ask, honestly, of all three of these, A, B, or C, who's the prettiest? Reba. Don't feel guilty for saying it. She's prettier than all those. Fourth option, which Amy did to me this morning without me knowing about it, my wife. But you guys better not be lusting after her. Okay? Okay? But you see how we are geared to that. It is not wrong to feel attracted to someone because that's how we are designed. We're designed to notice beauty. And then it attracts us. I'll tell you how me and my wife first met. I saw her in church. She was singing up on stage, and I said, whoa. She was beautiful. And that was the initial draw. So there's that attraction. Now, ladies, I don't want y'all to feel left out, so we're going to do this with you. So the first image, Superman, right? Henry Cavill, okay? See the strong jawbone, okay? Handsome-looking guy. Second image, again, Google average-looking man. Now, what was sad about this is I think I actually own that same shirt he's wearing. So if you put hair on that, that might be me. Okay. And then C, Marty Feldman. Okay. Who's prettiest? A. Okay. Now, when you said that the A is the prettiest, oh, and there's Paul. If you said which one's the prettiest, were you lusting after that person in your heart? No, you're simply acknowledging that is a beautiful person. And so I say that because oftentimes we feel guilty, but it's where we allow our mind to run off with the image and to try to control that person. That person exists simply for my gratification. And we go places outside this covenantal relationship that God had made. Jesus says, you've already committed adultery in your heart. And notice where the source of all this is. It's in your heart. Mark 7, verse 21. Jesus says, from within, out of a man's heart come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery. Okay, and I say this because if you think the solution to the lust problem is we're all going to have to dress like Eskimos from head to toe, guess what? Eskimos even deal with lust. It's not just about what is covered or uncovered. Now, there's no whole other sermon about that. But that's why it's important for you to guard your heart. Not just your eyes, you guard your heart. And this is where you go to the source of the problem. Let me give you an example. If you were in your kitchen and you were sitting there eating supper and your kids were upstairs taking a bath, and then all of a sudden you looked up and there's a little drip of water coming from the ceiling, and then it's falling on the floor, and there's a puddle of water on the floor. Is your first response to grab a towel and to clean up that water? No. Your first response is, what's causing all this? Go upstairs, check on it. Why is this water leaking? And that's what Jesus says. This is an issue of your heart. So you got to check your heart. What is going on? And that's why Jesus wants us to look deeper. Because lust and all these things come from your heart. And so you have to heal the heart. As we sang this morning, create in me a pure heart, O God. Now, just on a side note, just from what we've said so far, do you all realize the danger of pornography? How pornography simply exists as a consumer good, to see people as objects. not as people made in the image of God, but loved, saved by him, but rather just someone who exists for your self-gratification and the damage that comes from that. Now, I wish I had more time to go over the next part, but I do want you to see just how connected what Jesus said about lust and adultery is to divorce. Now, I want to talk about this knowing that this is a difficult topic for many folks. Verse 31, Jesus says, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now remember, in these antitheses, Jesus is always either correcting or clarifying a way that a law was being viewed at that time. And we know from reading the Mishnah, which is the Jewish rabbi teachings of that day, that there are basically three schools of thoughts on how you saw divorce. The first one came from Rabbi Shammai, who said you could only divorce when a person is guilty of adultery. Hillel said that you could only divorce for a failure of the spouse. And Akiba, well, he said you could divorce for any reason. So, to keep in mind with this, women could not divorce. They can protest it, but they couldn't divorce. And so of these three, guess which one was the most popular of that day? The last one. And so when Jesus here, when he talks about divorce, he is not covering everything there is to be covered on divorce. Because we know in 1 Corinthians 7, Paul adds some things about why people can be divorced. So this is not the end all and everything about divorce. But what Jesus is saying here, this is a way of protecting women. And looking at this covenantal relationship of marriage and this inherent worth of women. And saying, guys, you just cannot kick this person out because she burnt the toast. You cannot just say, I found someone prettier and just leave her. No, this is a child of God. You made a promise to her, and you just can't get rid of her. You can't just dump her. And then it says, if anyone marries her, commits adultery. What Jesus is saying there is, guys, you can't dump her, then pick her back up, and then dump her again and pick her back up like she's just an object. And you can't just pick her up and have, hey, buddy, you take her now. And just pass her around. No. She's made in the image of God, and this marriage covenant is sacred. Why? Marriage, remember, marriage is the way that God uses to explain our relationship with him. The primary way that God's relationship with his people is described in Scripture is marriage. That's why adultery is so bad. And you see the harm that happens to God when we go away from him. Again, I wish I had more time to talk about this. One day we'll do a whole sermon on divorce. But I say this because I have heard of this passage being used as a way to tell people, women especially, to remain in horrible marriages. I had a relative who was literally kicked out of her church, excommunicated from her church because she left her husband. Now, it didn't matter to the church leadership that he was beating her to a pulp, but she had the audacity to leave him when he didn't cheat on her. Now tell me, does that sound like Jesus? No. If y'all want to hear a good talk on divorce, read stuff by Charles Swindoll. Charles Swindoll talked about this and how his views of divorce changed when he had to go rescue his daughter in the middle of the night from an abusive husband. The point I want to make of this is that divorce, I see divorce like amputation. Is very painful no matter how you do it. But sometimes it's necessary. But even when it's necessary, it should be the last resort after all other avenues of healing has taken place. But sometimes it has to be done. So what does this mean for us? How this passage with all this stuff, how do we keep our hearts pure? Well, first of all, I want to say we need to keep in mind of our fallen nature. How many of us look at this and say, well, this will never, ever happen to me. I will never do that. I will never be guilty of that. I want to read to you a list of names. Karl Barth, Ravi Zacharias, Bill Hybels, Brian Houston, Jimmy Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, Steve Lawson, Tony Evans, Robert Morris, Matt Chandler, Martin Luther King Jr., King David, King Solomon, Judah, and I go on and on and on. What do all these men have in common? They're all men of God who were guilty of some form of sexual immorality. Now, if that could happen to them, why do you think you're immune from it? That's why we say, guard your heart. And that's what Jesus means in verse 29. If your right eye calls you to sin, gouge it out. Throw it away. It doesn't mean literally you do this. But it means, what is it that's causing you to be tempted with this? It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand calls you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. In other words, if you know something is a source of temptation for you, get rid of it. For some of y'all, that's social media. For some of y'all, it's a computer. But whatever is causing this in your life, Jesus says, get rid of it. Remove that temptation. Second of all, don't let your mind run off with things it shouldn't run off with. 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, take every thought captive. You cannot help seeing attractive folks, okay? And then you'll be attracted to them. That's fine. That happens. But what do you let your mind do with it after that? Do you allow it to go in that realm of fantasy where you take off with it? Martin Luther had the best explanation of this. He said, you cannot prevent a bird from landing on your head, but you can prevent him from building a nest there. When you have that thought, take it captive. Get up. Go for a walk. Turn the channel. Get out. Do something. Third thing, this is a big one for me. Have a higher view of humanity, of marriage, and the gift of intimacy. See this marriage as a beautiful thing. See the gift of intimacy within that marriage as a beautiful thing. The Bible does. If y'all want homework on this, read the Song of Songs as a couple together. You will blush. But see people as Jesus sees them. One of the biggest things for me about this issue is that I'm not just a pastor. I am not just a husband. I am a father of 3 beautiful girls. And the idea of someone looking at them as if they were nothing more than a piece of meat, that is where the do not murder comes in. But more important than that, when you look at a person, remind yourself, this is someone made in the image of God. Someone who Jesus loved and died for. And someone who, when we see him, they will be like him, glorified. See their worth. The next, because I know this issue deals with a lot of us, remember that we are broken, that we battle temptation always. We struggle to live up to the standard, but we often fall short. But remember the grace of God to forgive and to restore. God is a God of grace, and we will stumble and fall. In Romans chapter 7, Paul says, I would not have known what coveting was unless the law said. You remember that? We looked at that? Do you know the word that Paul uses there for Covington is not what we typically translate Covington? It's actually the word that is used here in Matthew chapter 5 that is translated lust. Paul was talking about his struggle with lust. And Paul says, the things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do. Who's going to save me from this wretched man that I am? But he ends it with, thanks be to God through Jesus Christ who gives us the victory. Remember, we started the Beatitudes off with, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, and those who say, God, I can't do this without you. I need your help. And you find that grace and forgiveness. And that's why the biggest thing is to stay close to God. Psalm 119, verse 9 says this, how can a young man keep his way pure? By living according to your word. I seek you with all my heart. Do not let me stray from your commands. I have hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. Jesus, on the night before he was betrayed, had a great prayer he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. He said, not my will, but your will be done. And what better prayer for us to pray whenever we feel tempted in this way, to simply say, God, you know what my body's wanting. You know what I'm wanting. But not my will, but your will be done.